Okay, without Googling it, where do you think China ranks in terms of export dependence among the G20 countries? Is it in the top 5? Top 3? Is it number 1? Nope, none of the above. The actual answer is, well, you'll have to keep watching to the end of the video to find out. Nah, I wouldn't do that kind of cheap YouTuber nonsense to you. The answer is 17. China is ranked 17 out of 20 in export dependence, making it one of the least, not most, export-dependent economies on this planet. Yep, it's yet another case of everything we thought we knew about China is wrong. Hi, and welcome to the channel. And if you're coming here from Quora, then, well, thanks for clicking that link. And sorry it took so long. As you've guessed by now, I'm going to start this channel by debunking the biggest false narrative about the Chinese economy. Namely, that it's built on exporting cheap consumer goods to the Western world, specifically to the BMI-rich citizens of the Trumpenreich, which is what I'm calling the US of A. Now, why is debunking this false narrative important? Why does it even matter if China is or isn't dependent on exporting to the West for its economic growth? It's important because it is this belief that the Chinese economy rises and falls on the backs of American consumers that underpins Trump's 2 million IQ trade war against China. Trump thinks that if he can beat Chinese exports, then he can beat China. In his big, beautiful brain, all 1.4 billion Chinese make their living by cranking out MAGA merch and iPhones.
Bruh.
And to be fair to Trump, whom I shall henceforth refer to as Big D, he's far from being the only man in power who believes that export dependence is China's Achilles heel. Even prominent economists will, knowingly or otherwise, promote this same false narrative. But what these experts will never do is actually back up their claims with actual hard data. They don't need to, because the idea that China is built on exporting cheap plastic gadgets to white people is so deeply ingrained in the Western psyche that folks just take it as a matter of fact. Like how ice is cold, water's wet, and Jeffrey Epstein was a Mossad asset whose mission was to collect blackmail and powerful Western elites like their respective countries will be forced to support Israel's agenda without question. Not sure what happened there. Maybe we can cut that minute out of the tape. Anyway, today I'm going to tell you the numbers that Western economists and people pretending to be economists conveniently leave out. And then you can decide for yourself if the Chinese economy really is built on Labubus and Stanley Cups. And don't worry, I'm not going to bore you with 20 minutes of econ analysis, though I could. It's actually not that complicated. For the TikTok brain among you, there are just 3 numbers that you need to take away from this video. The first number is 20, the second number is 15, and the third is 3. 20 is the percent of China's GDP that actually comes from exports as of 2024. And even this relatively low number has been dropping for the past 20 years.
Bruh.
And yes, that is a low number
Bruh.
relative to nearly all other countries, which is
Nope.
why, as I revealed earlier, China's ranked 17 out of 20 countries in export dependence. This means that 16 of the top 20 countries are more export dependent than China, with only 3 being less export dependent. As for how much of China's exports actually go to the US, well, that's where we get the second number, 15. Only 15, not 50% of China's export industry depends on the US. And so if we do the math, we get the third number, which conveniently is 3. Yes, only 3%
Bruh.
of China's GDP comes from exporting to the Trumpenreich. And given that China grows at about 5% a year, Losing 3% would be like losing 7 months of economic growth. It would be significant, for sure, but hardly the total collapse of the Chinese economy as some economists seem to think. And of course, China will find alternative markets for its exports. It's been doing exactly that since 2017 when the trade war meme first started. Back then, the Trumpenreich share was 21%, and China has shrunk that number down to 15%, while still maintaining robust export growth. So, yeah, when fancy folks on TV confidently declare that the total decoupling between China and the United States is unthinkable, well, it's not.
Nope.
It's very thinkable because it's been happening for the past 8 years. In fact, among the G20 countries whose number one export destination is the US, China is almost the least US dependent. Only Germany has a smaller share of its exports going to the US at just 10% compared to China's 15%. So again, if any major economy can decouple from the Trumpenreich without too much trouble, it would actually be China. Okay, so that's a lot of numbers I just threw at you, and I know that some of you out there are vibes brain, shall we say. So all you really need to remember is that nearly every major economy is more export dependent than China is, including the countries that no one ever talks about as being export dependent, like the UK, France, Italy, and Turkey, yay, which I guess is what we're calling Turkey now. So, why is this the case? Firstly, why isn't China more export dependent? And secondly, why do some people in the West insist that it is? The answer to the first question is quite straightforward. China is a big economy.
Big.
So, while it is entirely true that everything you're using is made in China,
Thank you for shopping
there's
at
still
Walmart.
more to China than just making everything that you use. There's also China, China itself, which is big
Huge.
and filled with Chinese people. Lots of them, I've been told. So there's a whole lot of economic activity, aka GDP, that never leaves the country. And this is why you see a rough correlation between the size of the overall economy versus how export dependent it is. For a smaller economy like South Korea, all they need is just a few big export giants like Samsung, LG, Blackpink,
Nope.
and then its export sector will become huge.
Huge.
Well, at least relative to the rest of its economy. This is why smaller economies can easily become dependent on their outsized export industry. For example, 97% of Vietnam's GDP comes from exports. Yes, 90 freaking 7%. Now, that is a real export dependent economy. China is obviously a little bit bigger than Vietnam, just a tad. So, even if it is the global factory, it still has plenty more GDP that's not for sale on Temu. Now, the answer to the second question of why the West insists that China is export dependent against all data proving otherwise is far more controversial. And hold on while I put on my Wu Mao hat. Okay, good. Let me chant the Wu Mao mantras to initialize my Wu Mao protocols. Taiwan is not a country.
Correct.
China does not interfere in the domestic affairs of other countries.
Correct.
Troops will end US dollar dominance.
Wu Mao mode initialized.
Okay, done. Wu Mao mode initialized. All right, so the deeper reason why the Western world wants to believe that China is export dependent is because it allows the West to take partial or total credit for China's economic success. This narrative that China is export dependent implies that China's entire economy is just Temu, Shine, and Walmart. Therefore, without the West, there would be no Chinese economy. In other words, we, the West, made the Chinese miracle and not the Chinese themselves. And as I've shown already, this narrative of a Chinese economy built on Western consumer charity simply isn't supported by any of the data, which is why you never hear any Western pundits presenting this data. It completely undermines the narrative that they're trying to push. And I think for most talking heads, they're not even aware of the data. They never bother to look. I mean, why would they? Water is wet, ice is cold, and the Chinese economy is built on Temu. So now that we've established that there's more to the Chinese economy than Temu and Walmart, that leaves us with the question of where does China's GDP actually come from, if not from making Labubus and iPhones? I mentioned earlier in the video that large economies tend to have more of their GDP coming from domestic sources. And obviously, this is true for China, which is the largest economy
China
in the world.
number 1.
China has 1.4 billion Chinese,
India
and
number
their
1.
collective activity is what really drives the country's GDP. But beyond that, China is special even among large economies. Unlike the US, Japan, or any other major economy, the largest component of China's GDP is not consumption, but is investment. Investment in technology, infrastructure, education, healthcare, and public safety. Those thousands of skyscrapers, tens of thousands of subsidized hospitals, free schools and universities, and millions upon millions of kilometers of highways and bridges and high-speed rail. Building out all of that, that is where the lion's share of China's economic activity was really generated. So, all this means is that if you want to see where China's GDP really came from, don't go looking on Amazon or Walmart. Instead, open your eyes to China itself. All that GDP is right there. And regardless of how high the Trumpenreich wants to jack up tariffs or sanctions, they're not going to make a dent in China's domestic economy. So, yeah, there you have it. Anti-China myth debunked, Western lies defeated, China's century of prosperity initiate. Sorry,
Wumao
I
mode
forgot to
disarmed.
turn off the Wumao mode. My bad. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed my little autistic rant and maybe even learned something. If you stayed this far into the video, then you need to tap that like button, subscribe for more, and wipe your butt and get off the toilet. All right, see you next time.